Hi, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we are diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute. It was a Tuesday in April. The kind of gray, restless morning New York does better than any other city I know. And I was at my desk in the front room transcribing the germination notes Wolfe had dictated the day before about a cross he was attempting between two Miltonia hybrids, when the doorbell rang at 11:40, which is to say 20 minutes before Wolfe was due down from the plant rooms and in no mood whatsoever to be interrupted. I went to the hall and looked through the one-way glass panel Wolfe had installed years ago on the theory that a man should never open a door blind, and saw a woman standing on the stoop in a gray wool coat that had cost more than my car, holding herself very straight in the way people do when they are trying not to shake. I opened the door. Mr. Wolfe's residence? That's right. I'm Archie Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe is occupied until 11, but you're welcome to wait. I telephoned an hour ago. I was told to come at noon. She had a low voice, controlled, the voice of someone who had rehearsed what she meant to say and was frightened it wouldn't come out right. My name is Eleanor Praed. I knew the name. Everybody in New York who read a newspaper knew the name, because her brother, Julian Praed, had been the head of Praed & Kessler, the textile house that had put half of Fifth Avenue in velvet and brocade for 30 years. And Julian Praed had been found dead in his office 6 days before with a letter opener in his chest, and no shortage of people who'd wanted him there. I brought her in and put her in the red leather chair, which is the one Wolfe reserves for clients, and told her Mr. Wolfe would be down promptly at 11. Which was a lie of exactly 19 minutes, since it was 11:40, and Wolfe's schedule runs from 9 to 11 and 4 to 6 in the plant rooms, regardless of who is bleeding in his office. At 3 minutes past noon, the sound of the elevator announced him, and he came in moving the way he always does, like a fastidious iceberg, and lowered the 1/7 of a ton of him into the chair behind his desk built to hold it. He looked at Miss Praed the way he looks at an insect he hasn't yet classified, not unkindly, just thoroughly. "Madam, I'm told you telephoned." "Yes, I need to hire you, Mr. Wolfe, to find out who killed my brother. The police are presumably attending to that." "The police," she said, and her hands, which had been folded, tightened on each other, "have arrested Marcus Devereaux. He didn't do it." Wolfe's eyes, which had been half closed, in the fashion that makes strangers assume he's either bored or asleep, opened, perhaps a 1/16 of an inch further, which for him is the equivalent of another man leaping to his feet. "Devereaux is your brother's business partner, I believe." "Was. They dissolved the partnership 8 months ago, badly." She looked at her hands. "That's why the police like him for it. But Marcus wouldn't have used a letter opener on a man he could have ruined a dozen cleaner ways, and besides, he was with me the night it happened, only I can't say so without ruining us both, and he won't let me say it, and so he's sitting in a cell being noble, and I am going out of my mind." I revised my opinion of her nerve upward considerably. That's not an easy thing to say to two strangers in a stranger's office at noon. Wolfe regarded her a while, then rang for beer, which meant he intended to stay in the room, always a promising sign. "You want me to find another culprit to substitute for Mr. Devereaux. That is not investigation, madam. That is manufacture. I want you to find the truth. If the truth happens to be Marcus, I'll accept it, though I don't believe it. But nobody's looking, Mr. Wolfe. The police have their man, and they're not troubling themselves further, and I have money, and I have nothing else to do with it that matters half as much." "How much money?" She named the figure that made me sit up a little straighter at my desk, and Wolfe's expression didn't change at all, which is his particular art. He can hear a fee that would make Fritz weep with joy and look like a man being told the time. "Who else had reason to want your brother dead?" "Everyone at Praed & Kessler had reason to want somebody dead, Mr. Wolfe. It was that kind of house." She began unprompted to talk, the way clients do once the dam goes, the details spilling out of order, which I was already sorting in my head into the notebook I'd need later. There was Corinne Fell, the house's chief designer, brilliant and unstable, who believed Julian had been stealing credit for her collections for a decade. There was Theodore Marsh, the comptroller, who had been quietly moving money in ways Julian had discovered 3 weeks before he died. There was Devereaux himself, cut out of the company he'd co-founded, humiliated in a settlement that had made the trade papers. And there was Julian's own wife, Inez, 20 years his junior, from whom he'd been separated in fact if not in law for over a year, and who stood to inherit the whole concern. A commodious field, Wolfe murmured, which is his way of saying he was interested despite himself. They were all in the building that evening. It was the night before the spring line went to the buyers. Everyone works late. Everyone was in and out of everyone's office. Any one of them could have done it, and none of them can prove they didn't. Wolfe sighed, the enormous sigh of a man contemplating labor. Madam, I dislike leaving this house. I dislike suspects who lie, which all of them will. I dislike murder cases generally, as they are untidy and end badly for someone, regardless of my performance. I am inclined to decline. You haven't quoted a fee you'd accept. That, I could have told her, was exactly the wrong thing to say to a man who prizes the appearance of being unmoved by money nearly as much as he prizes the money itself, and exactly the right thing to say to get him to take the case, because now declining would look like admitting the sum hadn't tempted him, and admitting that would be a kind of lie Wolfe considers beneath him. I will require, Wolfe said, a retainer and the freedom to pursue whatever the facts suggest, including a conclusion unfavorable to Mr. Devereaux, and including a conclusion unfavorable to you, should the facts point there. Archie will need access to the offices of Praed and Kessler, to the personnel, and to whatever the police have already assembled, which he will obtain through Mr. Kramer with his usual tedious charm. Anything, whatever you need. Then we are retained, provisionally. He rang for beer a second time, which Fritz was already bringing, and looked at me with the flat, unhurried expression that means the day's routine has just been overturned, and I am the one who will be doing the overturning. Archie, get the particulars of the murder from Miss Praed, the room, the hour, who admits to being where. Kramer, and inform him, with appropriate deference, that he is about to have company. Miss Praed let out a breath I think she'd been holding since she rang the doorbell, and thanked him in a voice not quite steady. And I got out my notebook, because whatever else was true, it looked like I'd be leaving the house that afternoon, and Wolfe would not, and between us that was really the only division of labor that had ever mattered. Getting the particulars out of Miss Praed took another 20 minutes, and getting them past Inspector Kramer took considerably longer, because Kramer has never in his professional life granted Nero Wolfe anything without first making a speech about how Wolfe ought to mind his own business, followed by another speech about how he'd allow it this once, followed by a final speech about how it had better not be like the last time. I let him get through all three, and then took a taxi down to Praed and Kessler's offices on West 36th Street, with a note from the DA's office that got me past a bored patrolman guarding a door that no longer needed guarding. The workroom of Praed and Kessler occupied the whole 7th floor, a long gallery of cutting tables and bolts of fabric in every shade a rich woman might want draped over her, and at the far end, behind a glass partition, was Julian Praed's private office, still sealed with police tape, where a man had been sitting at his desk one evening, looking over spring samples, and had ended it with 11 inches of steel in his chest, put there, according to the medical examiner's report Kramer had let me glance at, sometime between 6:40 and 7:30. I didn't linger at the door. I'd come to talk to people, not stare at furniture. Corinne Fell had a corner office done entirely in shades of gray, which I took to be a designer's idea of restraint, and she received me standing, arms folded, a tall woman somewhere past 40, with the kind of face that has practiced not showing things. I've already spoken to the police 3 times, she said, before I'd gotten my name fully out. I'm not the police. I work for Miss Praed. That got a flicker. Not warmth, but attention. Eleanor's paying for a private detective. To save Marcus, I suppose. To find out what happened. Were you close to Mr. Devereaux? I was closer to my own work, which Julian took credit for at every buyer's preview for 9 years, so if you're hunting for someone who disliked him, you can stop hunting and start writing. She said it flatly, an old grievance worn smooth from handling. I didn't kill him if that's the next question. I was in this office until past 8 fitting a muslin. Ask my assistant. I will. Where were you between 6:40 and 7:30 specifically? Here, alone for part of it. My assistant left at 7 to catch a train and came back at 1:30 with sandwiches, which I imagine looks exactly as convenient as it is inconvenient, Mr. Goodwin, and I can't help that. I made a note that her alibi had a 50-minute hole in it, precisely the size of the murder window, and thanked her, and she looked at me with something that might have been contempt for the whole exercise, or might have been fear, doing a very good impression of contempt. I couldn't tell yet, and said so to myself, which is a habit Wolfe drilled into me. Write down what you don't know, as carefully as what you do. Theodore Marsh's office was smaller, and looked like the office of a man who did sums for a living, and resented being looked at while doing them. He was gray-templed, precise, and answered every question with the exactness of a man reciting a deposition he'd rehearsed. I was at my desk, reconciling the spring shipment invoices from 6 until nearly 8, he said. Alone. I realize that's no alibi at all, and I've made my peace with how it sounds. Mr. Praed discovered some irregularity in the accounts recently. That's the word going around. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and gone. Word travels faster than accuracy in my experience. There was a discrepancy. I was in the process of explaining it to Mr. Praed's satisfaction when he died, which I'll admit is unfortunate timing for me, and considerably worse timing for him. Had you explained it to his satisfaction? We hadn't finished the conversation. He looked at his hands, folded very neatly on the blotter. I don't expect you to take my word on that, Mr. Goodwin. I wouldn't in your position. I left him with the impression, accurate as far as it went, that I hadn't taken his word for anything, and went to find Marcus Devereaux's old office, which I was told had been given over to a junior designer the week after the settlement, a fact that told me something about how fast a company moves on from a man it has decided to forget. I caught Enos Praed, not at the office, but by telephone arrangement, at the Praed apartment on Park Avenue, a place done up in the kind of cool, expensive emptiness that looks photographed even when nobody's taking a picture. She received me in a sitting room the size of Wolfe's office, and twice as cold, wearing black that had clearly been chosen with some care. I imagine you think a wife who inherits everything is the obvious suspect, she said, before sitting down, which struck me as either candor or a very good opening gambit, and I hadn't decided which. It occurred to me, where were you that evening? Here, alone. My husband and I hadn't lived as husband and wife in over a year, Mr. Goodwin. Goodwin? Whatever the license said, and I have no one to vouch for my evening, because I've gotten quite used to having no one to vouch for my evenings. There was an edge under that, old and tired, not fresh grief so much as fatigue with a marriage that had ended long before its principal died. If you're waiting for me to weep, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. I didn't love him. I also didn't kill him. Those two facts can coexist. Would you have benefited from a divorce, or from his death? Her mouth did something almost like a smile. That's a very direct question. It's the one that matters. Considerably more from his death. He'd have fought the divorce for years out of spite, and I'd have come out of it with a fraction of what I now stand to inherit outright. Make of that whatever your arithmetic requires. I'm not going to pretend the number doesn't exist. I made of it exactly what she'd handed me, which was a motive stated so plainly it almost disarmed itself. The way an honest man sometimes tells you the worst thing about himself first, so you'll trust the rest. And a woman with something worse to hide might do exactly the same thing on purpose. Last before 6, I found Marcus Devereaux himself, out on bail Miss Praed's money had arranged, in a small furnished apartment on the east side that looked like a man camping in his own life. He was younger than I'd pictured, dark, restless, and he wouldn't sit still the whole 20 minutes I was there. She sent you, he said. Not a question. She did. She also told me you were together that night, and that you're refusing to let her say so. Because it isn't true in the way that would help, and I won't drag her name into a courtroom over a lie that wouldn't even hold up. He said it fast, too fast, the words arriving ahead of the thought behind them, which is the kind of thing Wolfe would want written down verbatim and underlined. I was near the building. Not with her. I went to see Julian, to talk business, one last time, and he wouldn't see me. That's the whole truth, and it's worth exactly nothing to a jury. What time? Around 7. Maybe a little before. Which put him, by his own word, in the building, alone, unaccounted for, during the window that mattered, protecting a woman from a truth he'd just contradicted in the same breath he'd claimed to be protecting her with. And I rode the elevator down, thinking that of the 4 people I'd spoken to that afternoon, exactly none of them had an alibi worth the paper Kramer would eventually type it on. And every one of them had told me something that didn't quite sit flush against something else they'd said. And that this, I was fairly sure, was going to please Wolfe considerably more than it pleased me, since I was the one who'd have to sort it out, and he was the one who'd get to sit still, while I did. I got back to the brownstone at 6:10, which meant Wolfe was already down from the plant rooms and settled behind his desk with a book, a full glass of beer at his elbow, and a second bottle sweating gently beside it, in the posture of a man who has spent his afternoon in exactly the manner he prefers and expects a full accounting of mine. I gave it to him, all of it. Corinne Fell's 50-minute gap, and her old grievance worn to a shine, Marsh's discrepancy, and his very rehearsed calm about it. Inez Prade's arithmetic, offered up so freely it made me suspicious of the freeness itself. And Devereaux, who in one breath swore he hadn't been with Eleanor, and in the next revealed he'd been in the building alone at the hour that mattered, protecting her from a truth that didn't need protecting nearly so much as his own alibi did. Wolfe listened with his eyes shut, which is not sleep, whatever it looks like, and when I'd finished he opened them and said, "You spoke to none of them regarding the letter opener itself." Nobody volunteered, and I didn't think to press it. Why? Is it important which letter opener? It is important that a letter opener was the instrument at all. He reached for his beer, poured it with the ritual care he gives everything, and watched the foam settle to exactly 2 fingers before he spoke again. A letter opener is not a weapon a murderer brings to a killing, Archie. It is a weapon a murderer finds. Whose was it? That, I had to admit, I didn't know, and said so, and rang Kramer that evening to find out, which cost me another round of his speeches before he told me, with the air of a man conferring a great favor, that the letter opener had been Julian Prade's own, kept on his desk for years, silver-handled, a gift from his sister Eleanor, on some anniversary of the founding of the company, sharp enough to be dangerous, mostly by accident, until somebody had made it dangerous on purpose. I relayed this to Wolfe over dinner, which was veal kidneys that evening, prepared in a way that would have made me forgive Fritz almost anything, and Wolfe absorbed the information, along with 3 helpings, before he set down his fork with the particular precision that means he's about to say something he considers important. Then whoever killed him did not arrive intending murder, or if he did, he concealed the intention well enough not to bring an instrument, which is either remarkably controlled or remarkably improvised. Either is instructive. Instructive how? It narrows the temperament required, if not yet the name. He returned to his kidneys, and I knew better than to press him at the table, since Wolfe regards dinner conversation about business as a species of dyspepsia he will not inflict on Fritz's cooking. It was after dinner, in the office, with coffee, that Saul Panzer came by at Wolfe's earlier summons, having spent the afternoon doing the kind of quiet asking around that Saul does better than any other operative in New York, and what he brought back rearranged the furniture of the case considerably. The discrepancy in the books, Saul said, settling into the chair he always takes, the one nearest the door, isn't small, and it isn't recent. Marsh has been moving money out of the company accounts for going on 3 years, small enough each time not to trip anything, big enough over 3 years to matter. Prade found it maybe a month back. He hadn't gone to the police. He hadn't even fired Marsh yet. Word from a fellow I know in bookkeeping is Praed was the sort who liked to hold a thing like that over a man rather than settle it clean. Liked having Marsh owe him, is how my man put it. Which gives Marsh considerably more reason to want him dead than a discrepancy he'd already confessed to would suggest, I said. There's more. Saul had the look he gets when he's saving the best of it, which with Saul is a rare enough pleasure that I let him have it. Corinne Fell wasn't just sore about credit on the collections. She'd been quietly shopping herself to a rival house, Vantine's, on 7th Avenue, for the better part of a year. Had a deal near done. Praed found out about that too, same week he found the books. Told her if she walked, he'd see to it Vantine's heard exactly why, dressed up however unflattering he pleased. My man says Praed had taken to collecting people's weaknesses the way another man collects orchids. Wolfe's eyes came fully open at that, and I caught the flicker of something that in another man would have been a smile. An apt comparison, though I collect mine for pleasure, not for leverage. Go on, Saul. That's the bulk of it. Except, and here Saul paused in the way he does when he's not sure a thing is worth reporting, or worth mentioning that it's not sure. Devereaux's settlement wasn't as clean as the trade papers made it sound. Praed didn't just buy him out. He put a clause in restricting him from soliciting Praed and Kessler's clients for 5 years, which is standard enough, except Praed had been quietly threatening to enforce it retroactively over some accounts Devereaux picked up right after the split. Accounts Devereaux needs badly, being as broke as he currently is. There was a letter about it, lawyer to lawyer, dated the week before he died. So all 3 of them, I said, working it out as I said it, had a fresh, specific reason, as of the week Praed died, not some old grudge simmering for years. Fell, Marsh, and Devereaux all had something Praed had just discovered, or just weaponized, within days of each other. Which suggests, Wolfe said, setting down his coffee cup, either an extraordinary coincidence of timing, or a single cause behind all 3 discoveries. A man does not stumble onto 3 separate reasons to destroy 3 separate people within the same fortnight by accident, Archie. Someone brought him information, or he went looking, and something prompted the looking. Ines Praed, I said. She's the only one of the 4 who didn't get freshly threatened. She just stood to inherit, same as always. Precisely why she interests me rather less at this hour than the question of who told Julian Praed where to look, and when, and why that particular week. Wolfe folded his hands over the shelf of his stomach, which is his posture for serious thought, and was quiet long enough that Saul and I exchanged a glance. Archie, tomorrow you will return to that office and ask a single question of everyone you can find who worked near Julian Praed's private secretary, if he had one, or his correspondence, if he kept it himself. I want to know how a close and secretive man came into 3 damaging discoveries in the same 10 days. Someone handed him at least one of them, possibly all 3. And if nobody knows, then we will have learned that someone is being careful, which is itself a piece of information, though a less comfortable one to work with. He picked his book back up, which meant the evening's business was concluded as far as he was concerned, and I sat a while longer turning over the shape of it. 3 people cornered in the same short week, each with a fresh and specific reason to want Julian Praed dead, and somewhere behind all 3, a hand that had done the cornering, which might or might not have been the same hand that had finally reached for the letter opener on his desk. Getting all 3 of them into Wolfe's office at the same hour took the better part of 2 days, a good deal of telephone diplomacy on my part, and one outright lie to Theodore Marsh about the meeting being at the request of the district attorney's office, which wasn't true yet, but might as well have been, given how things stood. Eleanor Praed's money bought cooperation where charm didn't, and by Thursday evening at 9 o'clock, I had Corinne Fell, Theodore Marsh, and Marcus Devereaux arranged in the office in 3 of the yellow chairs I'd carried in for the occasion, with Inez Praed absent by her own choice, and Eleanor prayed, watching from the red leather chair, tense as a wire. Wolfe surveyed the arrangement, the way a general surveys a battlefield he intends to win, without moving from his tent, and began without preamble. "I have asked you here, because Miss Praed believes the police have arrested the wrong man. And I am inclined, provisionally, to agree with her, which means one of you is lying to me at this moment, and I intend to discover which. I will not conduct this as an accusation. I will conduct it as an inventory. Mr. Marsh, you first. You discovered, or rather, Julian Praed discovered, an irregularity in the company's accounts some 5 weeks ago. Describe it." Marsh's hands, folded on his knee, didn't move, but his voice had lost the flat precision of our first conversation, and gained something tighter. "There's very little to describe that I haven't already told your Mr. Goodwin. A pattern of transfers, over some years, that I'd characterize as unauthorized personal draws against company funds. Mr. Praed found them. We had begun discussing restitution." "Discussing, or you pleading, and he withholding decision?" "I object to the phrasing, though I can't say it's inaccurate." "Who told him where to look, Mr. Marsh?" "A discrepancy of that subtlety, sustained over years without triggering an audit, is not stumbled upon by a man occupied with fabric and buyers. Someone directed his attention." The silence that followed was, I thought, exactly 1 beat longer than an innocent man's would have been, and Marsh's eyes went, for just a moment, toward Corinne Fell, before he answered. "I don't know." "You looked at Miss Fell before answering." "Did I?" It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a denial either, which is the kind of answer Wolfe finds more useful than either. Wolfe turned. "Miss Fell, you had, at the time of Mr. Praed's death, a substantially advanced negotiation with Van Times to leave this house. Praed knew of it, and had threatened to poison the arrangement. How did he come to know?" Corinne Fell's composure, which had impressed me on our first meeting, held for exactly as long as it took her to decide the question wasn't going away. "I don't know how he found out. I was careful. I told no one at Praed and Kessler." "No one?" "No one." Then, after a pause that cost her something, I mentioned it to Inez, once. We had a drink after a difficult fitting, months ago, and I said more than I intended. I didn't think. She and Julian barely spoke by then. I didn't imagine it would travel to him. The name landed in the room like a dropped plate, and I saw Eleanor Praed's head come up sharply from the red chair, and Devereux's jaw go tight, and Wolfe's expression didn't change at all, which told me he'd been expecting the name to surface from somewhere, and had simply been waiting to see which door it came through. "Mr. Devereux," Wolfe said, without pausing to let the moment breathe, which is one of his more effective cruelties, "your settlement contained a non-solicitation clause your former partner had begun, in the week before his death, threatening to enforce retroactively against accounts you can scarcely afford to lose. How did Praed come to focus on those particular accounts, out of everything in his old partner's business, at that particular time?" "I have no idea." Devereux's answer came fast, the same quality it had had in his apartment, words outrunning thought. "Ask his lawyers. They handle that, not me. I put it to you that Praed did not stumble onto your client list any more than he stumbled onto Mr. Marsh's transfers, or Miss Fell's negotiations. Someone furnished him with a curated set of grievances against 3 people, within the same short span of days, shortly before he was killed by one of them. That is not coincidence, Mr. Devereux. That is a campaign." "Then find who ran it," Devereux snapped, "because it wasn't me. I didn't need help hating Julian Praed. I'd been managing that grievance quite well on my own for 8 months. Yet you were in his building, alone, at the hour of his death, ostensibly to see him, and he refused you, and you left, so you claim, without incident, protecting a woman from a truth that does not, on its face, require protecting." Eleanor Praed made a small sound from the red chair, and Devereux turned to her with something in his face that had nothing to do with the room or the case, and said, "Lo, Eleanor, don't." And she said over him, "Marcus, for God's sake, tell him the rest." And Wolfe let the two of them have their moment with the patience of a man who knows silence extracts more than questions do. "There is no rest," Devereaux said finally, to Wolfe, not to her. "I went to see him. He wouldn't see me. I left. That's all of it." "You left immediately?" "Yes. Mr. Goodwin has your own estimate of the time as around 7, maybe a little before. The medical examiner places death between 6:40 and 7:30. You have placed yourself inside the single most damaging window available to you, and offered nothing to narrow it in your favor. Either you are remarkably careless with your own defense, Mr. Devereaux, or the truth is less convenient than the version you've given me." Devereaux said nothing, which in that room, at that moment, was its own kind of answer, and Wolfe let the silence sit a good 10 seconds before he turned his attention to Eleanor Praed herself. Gently enough, but with the same unhurried precision. "Madam, you told me in this office that Mr. Praed was separated from you. Devereaux was with you that night, and that he wouldn't permit you to say so. He now tells me he was alone in the building, unaccompanied. One of you is misremembering an evening that neither of you should have any difficulty remembering exactly." Eleanor Praed's hands twisted together in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice had lost the controlled steadiness of our first meeting. "I lied to you, Mr. Wolfe. He wasn't with me that whole evening. He came to me afterward, after he'd seen Julian, after Julian turned him away. He came to my apartment near 8, upset, and stayed the night. And I told you he'd been with me the whole time because I thought if he had no gap at all, no window, you'd stop looking at him and start looking somewhere else. You lied to your own investigator to protect a man who has, in turn, been concealing from you the very details that would either clear or convict him." "Yes," she said, very quietly, "I suppose I did." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, which I have learned over the years to read not as fatigue, but as a man rearranging a great many facts into a new order behind his eyelids. And when he opened them again, he addressed the room generally, in the tone he uses when a session is nearly done and he wants everyone to feel the weight of what they've given him. "I have learned this evening that 3 of you were each freshly and specifically cornered by Julian Praed in the same short interval before his death. That the information behind at least one of those corners passed through his estranged wife. That Mr. Devereaux was in the building alone at the critical hour, and has misrepresented his account of that evening, even to the woman paying for his defense. And that everyone in this room has, at one point or another in the last 6 days, told a version of events more flattering than accurate." He paused, and the pause had weight. "That is not a solution. It is, however, considerably more than I possessed an hour ago, and I intend to have the rest of it before I am finished. Archie will show you out. I expect none of you to leave the city without informing him first." Wolfe does not deal in doormen, elevator operators, or the sort of quiet, patient asking around that turns up the small facts nobody thinks to volunteer because nobody thinks to ask. That part of the case belonged to me, and I spent Friday doing exactly that kind of asking, starting with the building on West 36th Street, and working outward in the widening circles Wolfe likes to call, when he's feeling generous about my methods, systematic, and which I privately think of as knocking on doors until somebody remembers something. The night watchman at Praed and Kessler, a heavy-set man named Otto Kruger, who signed people in and out of the building after the elevator operator went home at 6, kept a log that the police had already been through twice, and had told them, apparently, that he recalled Devereaux coming through around 6:40 and leaving inside 15 minutes, sour-faced, which matched what Devereaux himself had said. What Kruger hadn't been asked, because nobody had thought to ask it, was whether anyone else had come through after that. "Funny you should say," Kruger told me, over a cup of coffee I bought him at the diner where he ate his dinner most nights before his shift proper began. "There was a woman came in a little after 7. I didn't think much of it. Mrs. Praed used to come by the office regular enough, before things went sour between her and the boss, and I figured maybe she still had a key or a reason. I didn't log it, because she went up in the freight elevator, not the passenger one, which she used to do when she didn't want the front desk making a fuss over her. You're sure it was Mrs. Praed? Sure as I'm sitting here. Same coat, same walk. I've watched people come through that lobby 11 years, Mr. Goodwin. You get to know a walk. What time did she leave? I stepped out back for a smoke around 7:15. Company policy says I'm not supposed to, so I'd appreciate you not putting that in whatever report you're writing. And when I came back, the freight elevator was down at the ground floor again, so she'd have gone up and come down again inside that window. But I couldn't tell you to the minute. Which put Enos Praed, by her own account alone, at her apartment all evening, with no one to vouch for her. Instead, inside the building where her estranged husband was murdered, sometime in the second half of the very window the medical examiner had drawn, arriving not long after Devereaux had left in a temper of his own. I thanked Kruger, left him with the coffee and the clear understanding that his smoke break was between the two of us, and went next to the Praed townhouse on East 68th Street, the one Julian had kept after the separation, where I had a piece of luck in the form of a housekeeper named Mrs. Talley, who had worked for the family 11 years and had opinions about all of them. She'd apparently been saving up for someone willing to listen. Mrs. Praed came by the house 3-4 times these last 2 months, she told me, over tea she insisted on making, despite my protests. Always when Mr. Praed was at the office, said she was collecting some of her things she'd left, jewelry and the like, from her old dressing room. But she spent an awful lot of that time in his study, Mr. Goodwin, which never struck me as a place a woman goes looking for earrings. Did you ever see what she was looking at? I didn't pry, but I dusted that study same as any other room, and I noticed his correspondence file wasn't always where he'd left it. And once I found the ledger book he kept locked in the desk drawer, sitting out on the blotter, which he never did himself, being particular about where things sat. She sipped her tea, watching me over the rim. I didn't think it was my place to say anything. She's still Mrs. Praed, whatever the state of things between them. I asked whether Mr. Praed had said anything, in that last month, about a divorce, and Mrs. Talley's face did something careful, the look of a woman deciding how much loyalty a dead employer still deserved. He had his lawyer here twice in the last 3 weeks. I don't listen at doors, Mr. Goodwin, but I do carry tea trays, and I heard enough, going in and out, to know it was divorce papers being drawn, and something about the marriage settlement being void on account of, she hesitated, choosing the word with visible care, on account of her conduct. Infidelity, I believe the lawyer's word was. Mr. Praed meant to file within the week. He told the lawyer as much the last time they met here, not 4 days before he died. That, I thought, riding back downtown with my notebook considerably fuller than it had been that morning, was the kind of fact that reorganizes a case the way a hand reorganizes a chessboard. Not by adding a new piece, but by revealing which piece had been the queen all along. Enos Praed, who stood to inherit everything as a widow and next to nothing as a divorced wife found unfaithful under whatever prenuptial arrangement the Praed family lawyers had drawn up, had been led into her husband's study under the thin pretext of collecting jewelry, had almost certainly gone through his files and his ledgers there, had told Corinne Fell's confidence to her husband within days of learning it herself, and had been seen entering the building where he died, alone, in the second half of the murder window, by a night watchman who had no particular reason to lie about it, and every reason, in fact, to keep quiet, being more concerned about his smoke break than about implicating a woman he'd known for years. I called Wolfe from a drugstore booth near Grand Central, rather than wait until I got home, because some things won't keep for the ride, and gave him the whole of it. Kruger's freight elevator, Mrs. Talley's tea trays, and dislocated ledger. The divorce papers drawn and ready to file within the week Julian Praed died. There was a silence on the line of the particular quality Wolfe produces, when a great many facts have just clicked into a shape he'd been suspecting, but hadn't yet confirmed. And when he spoke again, his voice had the flat, satisfied calm of a man closing a book he already knew the ending of. "Come home, Archie. I believe we have moved from inventory to architecture, and I should like to examine the whole structure before Mr. Kramer's patience, or Mr. Kramer. Devereaux's continued incarceration obliges us to move faster than I prefer." I got back to the brownstone a little after 9, and found Wolfe in the office with a tray of orchids Theodore Horseman had brought down from the roof, for some purpose I never did learn, arranging them with the absorbed, unhurried attention he gives to anything that isn't murder. Which is his way of saying he needed his hands occupied, while his mind did the real work. "Sit," he said without looking up. "Recite it back to me in order, this time without commentary. I want the sequence, not your opinion of it." I gave it to him plain: Kruger's freight elevator and the woman in the gray coat going up sometime after 7, and coming down again before 1/2 past. Mrs. Talley's tea trays and the ledger left out of place, and the correspondence file disturbed. The lawyer's 2 visits in 3 weeks, and the word infidelity attached to a marriage settlement that would be void the moment divorce papers were filed. Papers Julian Praed had told his lawyer he meant to file within the week. Wolfe set down the last orchid, folded his hands over his stomach, and closed his eyes, which meant the recitation had done its work, and he was now assembling. "Consider the timing, Archie, as a mathematician considers a sequence, not as a moralist considers a motive. 5 weeks ago, Praed discovers Marcia's defalcations. We do not know how. Some short interval later, Mr. Saul's inquiries suggest within the same fortnight, he learns of Miss Fell's negotiations with a rival house. And we know precisely how. She confided in Innes Praed, who is the only common thread between that confidence and her husband's subsequent knowledge of it. In the same narrow window, he begins threatening Mr. Devereaux's client accounts, under a clause his lawyers had, until then, apparently left dormant. And in that same interval, entirely coincidentally according to nobody's testimony, but suspiciously convenient to one person's interest, he instructs his lawyer to prepare divorce papers alleging infidelity, which would void whatever settlement his wife stood to receive as a divorced woman rather than a widow. You think she found Marcia's discrepancy too, and used it. I think it considerably more likely that a woman with access to her husband's study, his ledgers, and his correspondence, access she manufactured under the pretext of retrieving jewelry, according to your Mrs. Talley, found rather more in that study than earrings. A woman facing the loss of a very large inheritance to a divorce she could not prevent has excellent reason to look for anything that might delay it, distract her husband, or occupy his attention elsewhere. What better distraction for a man like Julian Praed, who according to your own description collected the weaknesses of the people around him as another man collects orchids, than to hand him 3 fresh weaknesses to collect, drawn from his own business, in the very weeks he ought to have been occupied with ending his marriage. I turn that over. You're saying she fed him Fell's secret, Marcia's discrepancy, and Devereaux's client list, not to help him, but to keep him busy. Give him new toys to play with, so he'd delay the divorce. It has the virtue of explaining everything the facts otherwise leave unexplained. It explains why 3 unrelated grievances surfaced within days of each other, when nothing in any of their separate histories required that timing. It explains why a woman who claims estrangement from her husband was nonetheless visiting his study repeatedly under a threadbare pretext, and it explains rather elegantly why she was seen entering the very building where he died, alone, within the second half of the window in which he was killed, having no alibi whatsoever for the hour, and having offered none, because she did not expect to meet one. Then she's your murderer. Wolfe's eyes opened, and there was something in them I'd learned, over the years, to recognize as the specific pleasure he takes in a piece of reasoning that has just, in his own mind, gone one step too far and needs correcting. That, Archie, is precisely the conclusion I distrust, because it is too complete. A woman clever enough to manufacture 3 separate distractions to delay a divorce, sustained over weeks, with sufficient subtlety that none of the three victims suspected her hand in it until Mr. Goodwin's rather more direct methods pried it loose. Such a woman does not then walk into her husband's office during working hours, in a coat a night watchman would recognize on sight, and stab him with an implement lying on his own desk, leaving herself with no alibi whatsoever for the exact hour of death. That is not the crime of a strategist. That is the crime of someone caught by surprise, or someone in a temper, or someone who did not plan to kill at all and found the letter opener the way a man finds a stone in his path when he's already stumbling. You said yourself it wasn't a weapon anyone brought. Precisely. Which returns us to a question I posed on the first evening, and which we have rather lost in the pleasure of assembling motive. Who was in that office, in that final quarter hour? And what passed between them that turned a conversation into a killing? Devereux admits he came and was turned away. If Mrs. Praed entered afterward, as Kruger's account suggests, then either Devereux is lying about being turned away, and in fact gained entrance, or Praed admitted his wife where he'd refused his former partner, which itself would want explaining, given the state of their marriage. Or a fourth possibility we have not yet examined with sufficient rigor, which is that more than one of them was in that room within the same half hour, and we have been treating 4 separate accounts of that evening as 4 separate stories, when they may in fact be 4 fragments of a single one. Wolfe reached for the bell and rang for beer, which at this hour meant he intended to keep working rather than retire, a rarer commitment from him than most people appreciate. Consider, Archie. Devereux says he was turned away and left immediately, yet cannot account for the better part of an hour afterward, beyond a vague claim of walking, before arriving at Miss Praed's apartment near 8 in a state he himself describes as upset. Kruger places a woman resembling Inez Praed entering after Devereux departed, and departing again before 7:30. If Devereux did not in fact leave the building immediately, if he lingered, in the stairwell, in the corridor, anywhere a man might loiter unseen while deciding whether to attempt a second, more forceful conversation with a former partner who had just humiliated him, then he may have witnessed, or heard, or interrupted something in that office that his current account conceals entirely, whether from guilt of his own or from a determination to protect someone else. Inez Praed, or himself, or both. A man in love, Archie, protects clumsily and inconsistently, which is precisely the quality of his statements we have observed from the beginning. He gave you an alibi that placed him in the most damaging possible window, and then refused to improve upon it, even when improving upon it was plainly in his own interest. That is not the behavior of a guilty man covering his tracks with any competence, nor entirely the behavior of an innocent one being merely careless. It is the behavior of a man protecting a fact more damaging to someone else than to himself, and doing it badly because he has never in his life had practice at deception, and is temperamentally unsuited to it. I sat with that a moment, and it fit. The way pieces fit when you've been forcing them into the wrong picture and someone finally turns the picture around. So your theory is, Devereux didn't leave clean. He saw something or heard something involving Inez Praed and Julian in that last half hour, and he's been shielding her ever since, at the cost of his own defense. It is a theory, Archie, not yet a conclusion, and I intend to test it before I commit to it publicly, because a theory that merely explains the facts elegantly is not thereby proven. Elegance is a seduction, as often as it is a signpost. Telephone Mr. Kramer in the morning. I want to know whether the letter opener yielded any fingerprints beyond the victim's own. A detail I notice has gone conspicuously unmentioned in every account we've gathered, including the official one, which suggests either an oversight or a fact someone has been sitting on. He drank off half his beer in the manner of a man who has done a satisfying piece of work and intends to enjoy the reward of it. And then, I think, we shall arrange to have Mr. Devereux back in that chair, alone this time, without Miss Praed present, to soften whatever he says or doesn't say. A man protects a fact clumsily, right up until the moment protecting it costs someone else her freedom, instead of his own. I should like to find that moment and stand him in front of it. Kramer, when I telephoned him Saturday morning, gave me the information about the fingerprints with considerably less resistance than usual, which told me he'd been sitting on something that troubled him, and was almost relieved to have somewhere to put it. The letter opener had yielded 2 partial prints beyond Julian Praed's own, one belonging to Devereux, unsurprising given his history of borrowing pens and paperweights off his former partner's desk over a decade of partnership, and smudged enough to have been left days before the murder. The second, on the underside of the handle, where a hand might grip it in haste, was incomplete, but the lab had matched enough ridge detail to place it, tentatively, as a woman's print, and Kramer, with the particular bluntness of a man admitting an inconvenience, told me they hadn't yet found anyone to match it to because they hadn't thought to ask Ines Praed for a comparison set, on the theory that a wife with a solid alibi didn't need one. She doesn't have a solid alibi, I told him. She has no alibi at all, and a night watchman who puts her in the building. There was a silence on the line that cost Kramer something to produce, and then, I'll want that watchman's statement in writing by Monday, Goodwin, and I'll want to know what in blazes Wolfe thinks he's doing sitting on it since Thursday, which was fair, and I told him he'd have both and run off before he could work up a fourth speech. Getting Devereux back to the brownstone alone took less persuading than I'd expected. A man out on bail with a murder charge hanging over him doesn't have much appetite for refusing an interview that might clear him, and by 4 that afternoon he was back in the office, in the same yellow chair, considerably more tired-looking than he'd been at our first meeting. Wolfe didn't waste time on preamble this time. Mr. Devereux, the letter opener that killed Julian Praed carries your fingerprint, smudged, and according to the police laboratory, several days old, consistent with your habit, over 10 years of partnership, of using whatever lay on his desk without particular ceremony. It also carries a second partial print, a woman's, not yet identified by the police, because they had not thought to ask the one woman whose print it might be. Devereux's hands, which had been resting on his knees, went still in a way that told me more than any word could have. I am going to tell you what I believe happened that evening, Wolfe went on, and you are going to correct me where I am wrong, because I suspect you have been protecting a fact so long that correcting a false version of it will come as something of a relief. You went to see Praed near 6:40, as you've said. He refused you. You did not, however, leave the building. You lingered, in the stairwell, in a corridor, somewhere out of Kruger's sightline from the lobby, because a man freshly humiliated does not walk cleanly away from the building where his humiliation took place. He walks a little distance and stops and considers going back. That's not, Devereux started and stopped, and Wolfe let the silence do what his own words hadn't finished doing. While you lingered, Ines Praed arrived, entering by the freight elevator as she had apparently done on several previous occasions when she wished to avoid the front desk's notice. You saw her go up, or you heard the elevator, and being a man who had once been engaged to marry into that family, or near enough to it in sentiment if not in fact, you were curious, or concerned, or simply unwilling to leave without knowing what business she had with a husband she claimed to be estranged from. You went up after her, or you were already near enough to the office that you heard what followed without needing to go anywhere at all. Devereux said nothing, but his jaw had the set of a man holding a door shut against a wind that was going to get in regardless. What you heard or saw, Wolfe continued, his voice unchanged, was an argument, I should think, over the divorce Praed intended to file, and the infidelity he intended to allege, and the settlement it would void. A woman confronted with the loss of a very great deal of money by a husband she had spent weeks quietly managing and distracting rather than confronting directly, might, in that final conversation, lose the composure that had served her so well until then. I do not think you saw a premeditated killing, Mr. Devereaux. I think you saw, or heard, something closer to an accident born of fury. A woman reaching for whatever lay closest to hand, in a moment that had gotten away from her, and regretting it, before the weapon had properly left her grip. I didn't see anything, Devereaux said, but it came out wrong, too fast, the same tell I'd noted in our first conversation, words outrunning the thought behind them. And Wolfe caught it exactly as I did. You did not see the blow struck. I did not suggest you did. But you saw something, Mr. Devereaux. In the minutes after, Mrs. Praed leaving that office in a state that told you, without a single word needing to pass between you, precisely what had happened inside it. And rather than go to the police that night, or ever, you constructed an account of your own evening that placed you nowhere near the actual moment, protected her at some real cost to your own defense, and have maintained that protection through an arrest, a bail hearing, and 6 days in a cell, at the price of your own liberty, because you believed, wrongly, I think, though understandably, that silence was the only gift left you could give her. Devereaux's composure, which had held through Wolfe's entire recitation with the rigid quality of a man determined not to move, finally broke, not into words at first, but into a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere below his ribs. She didn't mean it, he said, finally, quietly, all the fight gone out of his voice. I saw her come out of that office, white as a bedsheet, shaking, and I went in after she'd gone, and I saw him, and I knew exactly what had happened, and I knew exactly what it would look like if I said so. A jilted partner accusing the widow of murder to save his own skin. Nobody would have believed a word of it, and she'd have gone to the chair for something that wasn't the same as murder. Not really. Not the way he'd cornered her for weeks. You are welcome to your assessment of what constitutes murder, not really, Mr. Devereaux, though I should tell you the law takes a narrower view, and juries narrower still. Wolfe's tone hadn't softened, but it had lost its edge of interrogation, settling into something closer to the flat patience he uses when a witness has finally arrived at the truth, and needs only to be walked the rest of the way through it. You have spent 6 days in a cell to protect a woman who, I would remind you, has not spent 1 hour of those 6 days doing anything whatsoever to protect you in return, beyond hiring an investigator and weeping in his office. That is not loyalty rewarded, Mr. Devereaux. That is loyalty spent on a woman who has, whether by design or by cowardice, allowed you to absorb the entire cost of her actions. Devereaux said nothing to that, but something in his face had shifted, the particular collapse of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time with any clarity, that the sacrifice he'd been making had bought him nothing from the person he'd made it for. I want your account in full, Wolfe said. Every detail you can recall of what you saw and heard in that corridor and in that office, in the order it occurred, and I want it now, because I intend to have this matter concluded within the week, and I do not intend to conclude it with an innocent man in a cell, while a guilty woman inherits a fortune built on the death she caused, and the silence you've been keeping for her since. Wolfe does not often ask for a full gathering twice in the same case, holding the view that repetition is inelegant, and that a detective who needs 2 audiences with the same people has not thought carefully enough about the first one. But Sunday evening he made an exception, and by 8 o'clock the office held more chairs than it usually does. Corinne Fell and Theodore Marsh in 2 of the yellow ones, Marcus Devereaux beside them, looking like a man freed of a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten how to stand without it. Eleanor Praed in the red leather chair, and Inez Praed, summoned by a telegram phrased carefully enough to seem like routine, and arriving in the same gray coat Otto Kruger would have recognized anywhere, seated a little apart from the others, near the door, in the manner of a woman who had already begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to plan an exit. Kramer stood near the bookshelves, with 2 of his men in the hall, having been persuaded, at some cost to Wolfe's patience, over the telephone that afternoon, to wait for the finish before making an arrest. "I asked you all here," Wolfe began, once Fritz had settled the last chair and withdrawn, "because 6 days ago an innocent man sat in a cell for a killing he did not commit, and because the truth of what did happen involves nearly everyone in this room, in one degree or another. And I dislike leaving loose ends when a full explanation costs me no more effort than a partial one." Ines Prade's hands, folded in her lap, tightened very slightly, and Wolfe noted it, I could tell, without appearing to look at her directly at all. "The essential fact of this case," he continued, "is that Julian Prade was a man who collected the weaknesses of the people around him the way another man collects orchids, not for pleasure in the thing itself, but for the power of holding it. Miss Fell's negotiation with a rival house, Mr. Marsh's years of quiet defalcation, Mr. Devereux's need of the client accounts his settlement threatened. Each of you concealed something from him, and each of you was, in the final weeks of his life, discovered and cornered within the same narrow span of days. A coincidence of timing that is not, in fact, coincidence at all." He paused and let his eyes move, unhurried, to Ines Prade, who did not look away, which I thought took a certain nerve, even at that late stage. Mrs. Prade was, by that point, an estranged wife facing a divorce her husband intended to file within the week, alleging infidelity, which would have voided a settlement that stood, by contrast, to make her a very wealthy widow, should he simply die married to her instead. She could not prevent the divorce by argument. Her husband was not a man who yielded to argument. She could, however, distract him from it, and delay it, by giving him something more interesting to occupy his considerable appetite for leverage. She had access to his study, under the pretext of retrieving jewelry left behind at separation, an access his housekeeper noted rather more often than jewelry retrieval required. In that study she found, or was given occasion to notice, Mr. Marsh's ledger discrepancies. She had independently learned of Miss Fell's negotiations with Vantine's directly from Miss Fell herself, in a moment of confidence between friends, that Miss Fell now understands rather less charitably than she did at the time. And whether she supplied the detail of Mr. Devereux's vulnerable client accounts, or merely confirmed her husband's own knowledge of them, the effect was the same. 3 fresh grievances, delivered to a man who loved nothing better than a grievance to manage, in the very weeks he ought to have been occupied elsewhere. Corinne Fell's face had gone the color of old paper, and she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I told her about Vantine's over a drink. I never thought." "You were not required to think anything, Miss Fell, beyond the ordinary trust one extends a friend," which Mrs. Prade abused rather thoroughly. Wolfe did not linger on the point, moving forward with the unhurried inevitability of a man who has already seen the whole shape of the thing, and is merely walking the rest of the room through it at a pace they can follow. The strategy succeeded for some weeks. It did not, however, succeed indefinitely, because a man managing 3 grievances at once eventually manages them badly, and Julian Prade, on the evening he died, appears to have confronted his wife directly, whether about the divorce itself, or about some detail of her involvement in the grievances she'd fed him. We cannot know with certainty, since only one witness remains to that conversation, and he was not, strictly, in the room. All eyes went to Devereux, who sat very straight, his jaw set, and said nothing, because Wolfe had already extracted what he needed the previous afternoon, and there was nothing left for him to add that would improve his position now. Mr. Devereux came to see Prade that evening, was refused an audience, and did not, as he originally claimed, leave the building. He lingered out of a temper he has since described to me candidly, and while lingering, observed Mrs. Prade arrive by the freight elevator, an entrance she had used on previous visits precisely to avoid notice at the front desk, and some minutes later observed her leave again, in a state of visible distress that told him, without a word passing between them, precisely what had occurred inside that office. He went in afterward, and found what he expected to find, and rather than report it, chose to protect a woman he still, by his own account, retained feeling for, at the cost of his own liberty. which he has now paid in full, and I should think, rather more than full. Inez Prade's composure had, by this point, begun to fray at its edges, a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there when she'd entered, and when she spoke, it was in the flat, careful tone of someone still hoping the ground beneath her hadn't fully given way. "This is conjecture, Mr. Wolfe. You have a watchman who thinks he recognized a coat, and a man who admits he saw nothing. I have somewhat more than that, Mrs. Prade, though I confess I saved it for last, out of a certain fondness for order." Wolfe's tone did not change at all, which made what followed land with considerably more force than if he'd raised his voice. "The letter opener that killed your husband carries a partial fingerprint, in addition to Mr. Devereux's old and irrelevant one, that the police laboratory has not yet matched to anyone, for the simple reason that no one thought to ask a grieving widow for a comparison set. Inspector Kramer's men are prepared to take one this evening, with your cooperation, or should you decline it, with a warrant obtained by morning." "I would suggest cooperation, madam, as the alternative reflects rather poorly on an innocent woman, and rather predictably on a guilty one." The silence that followed had a different quality than any that had come before it in that office, and it stretched long enough that I found myself counting the seconds, and it was Inez Prade herself who broke it, not with a confession exactly, but with something that amounted to the same thing. A long, unsteady breath, and then, in a voice that had lost every trace of the cool control she'd shown me in her Park Avenue sitting room. "He said he'd tell the court things about me that weren't even true, things he'd twisted from nothing, just to make certain the settlement was voided, and I got nothing, after everything, after years of—" and then she stopped, because there was nothing left to finish the sentence with that would help her. And Kramer, who had been waiting by the bookshelves, with the patience of a man who has learned to let Wolfe finish, before moving, nodded to his men, and the thing was, for all practical purposes, over. It was past 10 by the time the office had emptied of everyone but Wolfe, myself, and the smell of the coffee Fritz had brought in, and nobody had properly drunk. And Wolfe, settling back into his chair, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has restored order to a small corner of a disorderly world, said, "A tidy case, in the end, though it took its time announcing itself as tidy." "Tidy for you," I said. "Devereux spent 6 days in a cell being noble about a woman who let him rot there rather than say 6 true words to a policeman." "Loyalty misapplied is still loyalty, Archie, and a man is entitled to spend it foolishly if he chooses, though I agree the recipient showed considerably less discernment in choosing a champion than the champion showed in volunteering." He reached for his coffee, found it cold, and set it down again with mild disapproval. "Miss Fell will, I imagine, still go to Vantine's, her employer's death having removed the chief obstacle to her ambition rather more thoroughly than she could have arranged herself. Marsh will make his restitution, or attempt to, and Prade and Kessler will find some comptroller who steals rather less. And Mr. Devereux, I should think, will need some little while to decide whether the woman he protected at such cost was ever quite worth protecting, which is not a question I am equipped to answer for him, being interested chiefly in facts, and considerably less in the sentiment that so often obscures them. You could have told him that Thursday, and saved him 3 more days in a cell wondering. "I could have," Wolfe agreed, without the least sign of contrition. "But a theory insufficiently tested is merely an elegant guess, Archie, and I have found, over a great many years, that the distinction matters rather more to the man in the cell than the speed with which one arrives at it." He picked up his book, which was his way of declaring the case, and the conversation about it concluded, and I sat a while longer, turning over the wreck of it in my own head. A marriage gone cold, a fortune too tempting to leave to chance, and a man who'd spent his freedom on a woman who'd never once considered spending anything at all on him, and thought that for all Wolfe's talk of facts over sentiment, it was usually the sentiment that did the damage, and the facts that only, eventually, caught up to it.